Hey guys, how's it going? I hope you are well. Greetings from the circus. So, I've been looking at several different stories that I wanted to cover and trying to determine how I was going to break them up or address them. And I've decided that the best way to do this is to take the ABC morning show with George Stephanopoulos and his interview with Biden, and we're going to stop that interview at various points and we're going to expand on some of the ideas that they talk about throughout this interview. This interview is pretty wild and it covers a wide range of topics. This is my opinion here. This is not factual. This is just one man's opinion, but it's obviously a rehearsed, choreographed interview. George Stephanopoulos leads Biden into every subject matter topic, and he guides Biden through the interview, something that they never did for Trump, obviously, which who cares? But the point of the matter is they're helping this, forgive me, feeble man get through this. And you just have to wonder if he's having such a hard time getting through this, even with George Stephanopoulos, who's basically running the interview and leading him to each of his predetermined responses to each of the questions that he was fed before they did the interview. If he's having so much trouble doing that now, then what is his communications with world leaders like? Probably not a great situation. Some of the situations that have popped out of this interview have proven that to be the case. So as we tackle the different subjects, we're going to look at different facts and information surrounding the information that they're covering here. So without further ado, let's just get into it. We'll start and then we'll go from here.
So you've set your goals for the country, 100 million vaccine doses by next week, $100 million out the door, every American eligible for the vaccine adult American by May 1st, something close to normal on July 4th. But tell everyone, when is everything going to be normal for Americans?
The big problem here is that over the past week, we're starting to see that several countries in Europe, and indeed a few other countries, are acknowledging another wave of the CV and are now entering in a third cycle of lockdowns. Italy is going right back into a lockdown, and while there are states that are lifting mask mandates in the country, it doesn't look very promising outside of the country that we'll be reopening by July. It almost feels like this interview is preparation for people to understand that that's not going to happen. So he says, you said we were going to be open in July. We got 100 million jabs out by May. When are we going to be able to get back to normal?
Well, first of all, I won't even be able to meet the July 4th deadline unless people listen, wear masks, wash their hands, and socially distance. Because
the states that have lifted the mask mandates are now just going to be excuses for the federal continuation of this disaster. And when we are not allowed to have small parties in July, he will have his reasoning, right? Not every American who can take the jab is taking the jab, and millions of Americans stopped wearing masks early, and here are some fancy numbers that show you why we must go back into another lockdown, even though we are now a full year into the first 15 days to slow the spread.
Because not everyone by July 4th will have been vaccinated.
How do you get the politics out of this vaccine talk?
They put the politics into the jab talk. Let's be real. They were the ones saying, oh, well, you push the mRNA jab, you push the Johnson & Johnson jab, it's been pushed Operation Warp Speed and Donald Trump, and I wouldn't take anything from him. Burp, 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 burp. That's what started entering politics into this entire thing.
I honest to God thought we had it out. I honest to God thought that once we guaranteed we had enough vaccine for everybody, things would start to calm down. Well, they have calmed down a great deal, but I just don't understand this sort of macho thing about I'm not going to get the vaccine. I have a right as an American, my freedom to not do it. Well, why don't you be a patriot? Protect other people.
How about emphasizing the positive?
There's your little bit of manipulation. So it reminds me an awful lot of when they had that god-awful, horrible, pro-jab hip-hop cartoon to address the African-American hesitancy towards the jab.
Got the vaccine, you got the vaccine, they got the vaccine, we got the vaccine. We can get back to normal, let me inform you, let's all get the vaccine. It's about community immunity. I'm talking unity for you and me. If Doc says it's good, then trust me, it's good. Now let's all get the vaccine.
And this is the way that they're going to attack the patriot community's hesitancy towards the jab, right? So by asserting your right to not be injected with an unknown substance that has no long-term health effects studies is not being patriotic. You need to step up and take the shot to be patriotic. It is an unbelievable bit of mental manipulation, but it runs in line with the narrative of this interview. That who are the problem now? The problem is the patriot community.
How has life changed for you since you got the vaccine?
I can hug my grandkids now. They come over to the house. I can see them. I'm able to be with.
Completely choreographed. I'm going to rewind this, and just when he finishes his answer about the jab, and George Stephanopoulos says, "Well, let's think about how, in the context of you, has this helped you?" And just listen to how he's reading. This is acting. How about emphasizing the positive? How has life changed for you? Into the next question that they gave to Biden before the interview. Or more accurately, the Biden team gave George Stephanopoulos. But hey, they work together so closely. Who's the judge?
I've had the vaccine. And secondly, it has changed my life in the sense that I've been able to demonstrate to other people that I doubt whether people would expect me to take it, but I think it was safe, to make the case that it is safe to take the vaccine. It's important to take the vaccine.
Let's talk about the crisis at the border. Some heartbreak.
So now we've talked about the jab hesitancy among the patriot community and how it's going to be their people who refuse the jab. It's going to be their fault when we don't reopen in July, right? Next thing they need to go to is the damage control over the issues that Biden is creating down at the border wall.
Breaking scenes down there
Yeah.
right now. And a lot of the migrants coming in saying they're coming in because you promised to make things better. It seems to be getting worse by the day. Was it a mistake not to anticipate this surge?
Well, first of all, there was a surge the last 2 years in 19 and 20. There was a surge as well.
So think about what he just said, right? So Stephanopoulos says, was it a mistake not to anticipate this surge? And Biden says no. And then he says, there was a surge in 2019 and 2020. If there was a surge in 2019 and 2020, then why didn't you anticipate the one in 2021? This is literally why I'm asking you, should you have anticipated this? And Biden gives a non-response. And Stephanopoulos sweeps it under the rug and moves forward.
This one might be worse.
No, well, it could be, but here's the deal. First of all, the idea that Joe Biden said come, because I heard the other day that they're coming because they know I'm a nice guy and I won't do what Trump did.
This.
Yeah.
I heard the other day they're coming because I was a nice guy. And then you look at George Stephanopoulos, just look at that face. Oh, they are saying that you're so awesome.
They're coming because they know I'm a nice guy and I won't do what Trump did.
This.
Yeah. Well, here's the deal. They're not. The adults are being sent back, number one. Number two, what do you do with an unaccompanied child that comes to the border?
So the adults are being sent back. So a continuation of Trump-era policy. All right.
You repeat what Trump did? You take them from their mothers, to move them away, hold them in.
Wait a minute. Take them from their mothers? We're talking about unaccompanied minors. If it's an unaccompanied minor, then how are they taking he or she away from their mother? That would be an accompanied minor.
Cells, et cetera. We're not doing that. So what we're doing.
And then he said, put them in cells, et cetera, et cetera. So again, we know when that cage came from. It was an Obama era cage. Trump started the process of moving these children into other facilities because he refused to allow children who showed up unaccompanied to get the asylum without figuring out where they came from and who they came from.
As we have brought in HHS and also brought in FEMA to provide for enough safe facilities for them to not to get out of the control of the Border Patrol, which are not designed to hold people for long periods of time, particularly children, get them out of those facilities. And most of them come with a phone number. So
this is just, it's mind-numbing. So his assertion is what he's doing differently than the Trump administration is he's removing these unaccompanied minors. Trump had already started finding alternative places to put these unaccompanied minors at, right? Because he wasn't just catch and release. Biden is doing the same thing. The only difference he's saying is we're taking them out of the Border Patrol's custody and putting them into the custody of FEMA. Well, FEMA's reopening the old Trump-era tent cities and holding facilities for the unaccompanied minors. There's literally no difference here. The only difference is that the people who are coming up to get through our border have a different opinion of what will happen to them when they get here than what they did a year ago.
What we're doing is we're putting together an entire organizational structure so that within 7 days, they're able to get in the phone, contact that number, find out whether there is a mother or a father, whether it is safe, whether it is a secure circumstance to get the child to that adult.
His assertion on how he's going to fix this whole unaccompanied minor situation is, hey, listen, bub, a lot of them come here and they have a phone number. So we're going to create an entire governmental structure, right? So a whole new government structure to take the phone number that they come up here with and try to contact their relatives to find out why they came up here and is it safe for them to go back. It's exactly what was being done already.
It's going to take some time, though, to get those policies in place again. Do you have to say quite clearly, don't come?
Yes, I can say quite clearly, don't come. And what we're in the process of getting set up, and it's not going to take a whole long time, is to be able to apply for asylum in place. So don't leave your town or city or community. We're going to make sure we have facilities in those cities and towns run by DHS and also accessed with HHS, the Health and Human Services, to say you can apply for asylum from where you are right now.
Here's his new solution to answer the future problem of asylum seekers. The problem is it's completely flawed. Trump had already solved this problem by forcing Mexico to hold all these migrants in Mexico. There is where they were being processed on whether or not they could get asylum. What is the problem with processing the asylum requests in the country of origin? Anybody? That's right. These are countries, supposedly war-torn countries in destitute, highly dangerous countries that people are trying to get out of, fleeing for their lives. And you're telling me that we are now going to implant Department of Homeland Security, DHS, and FEMA personnel in all these countries, these dangerous countries, so that they can process the asylum paperwork in these highly dangerous countries, when they could just as easily do it in Mexico like they are now.
Make your case. We'll have people there to determine whether or not you are able to meet the requirement you qualify for asylum. That's the best way to do this. In addition to that, well, we also change the circumstances on the ground in those communities. You're going to diminish the reason why people want to leave in the first place.
Director of National Intelligence came out with a report today saying that Vladimir Putin authorized operations.
So now we're going to get into the Putin comments, and I'm sure you guys have heard about these comments in a roundabout way all across the interwebs. And what I really want you guys to pay attention to during this part of the interview is just how leading George Stephanopoulos is. He's very leading in his questions. The news headlines all across the country were Biden calls Putin a killer, but that's actually inaccurate. George Stephanopoulos called Putin a killer and asked Biden if he agreed with him. Some people say that's the same thing. It's not. It's a huge difference. One question is leading and walking somebody to where they need to go, and the other question is a legitimate question about policy. So pay attention to how leading George Stephanopoulos is right here. And then after this, we're going to go and we're going to listen to see what the Russian perspective on this whole situation has been. And remember, this is a choreographed, this is all set up ahead of time. This is the Biden administration is thinking this out and planning these responses beforehand. It makes it so much worse that Biden isn't just going off the cuff.
Found in those communities, you're going to diminish the reason why people want to leave in the first place.
Director of National Intelligence came out with a report today saying that Vladimir Putin authorized operations during the election to denigrate you, support President Trump, undermine our elections, divide our society. What price must he pay?
He will pay a price. We had a long talk, he and I. I know him relatively well. And the conversation started off, I said, I know you and you know me. If I establish this occurred, then be prepared.
You said you know he doesn't have a soul.
I did say that to him, yes. And his response was, we understand one another. I wasn't being a wise guy. I was alone with him in his office. That's how it came about. It was when President Bush had said, I've looked in his eyes and saw a soul. I said, looked in your eyes, and I don't think you have a soul. And looked back at me and said, we understand each other. Look, most important thing dealing with foreign leaders, in my experience, and I've dealt with an awful lot of them over my career, is just know the other guy.
So you know Vladimir Putin. You think he's a killer?
Mm-hmm. I do.
So what price must he pay?
The price he's going to pay, well, you'll see shortly. I'm not going to, by the way, we ought to be able, that trite expression, walk and chew gum at the same time. There are places where it's in our mutual interest to work together. That's why I renewed the START agreement with him. That occurred while he's doing this, but that's overwhelming in the interest of humanity that we diminish the prospect of a nuclear exchange.
Thinks that he's going to accuse the Russian government of doing most of the meddling in the 2021 election, call the leader of their country a killer, say that he has no soul, and then right after that say, but listen, there's areas where we're going to work together with Russia. I got news for you, Mr. President. Not anymore, there's not. There are no areas where Russia will now work with you. Good job. And y'all planned this? Now let's jump over to the Duran and see what's the Russian perspective on these comments by Biden.
All right, Alexandra, let's do a video here on what happened yesterday with the interview. Good Morning America, ABC News. I think it's Good Morning America, ABC News with George Stephanopoulos and Joe Biden. And my first thoughts with this interview was that this was a very well-scripted, stage-managed interview. I think there's no doubt about it that Stephanopoulos' questions were given to him, probably by the Biden White House, and that that Joe Biden was briefed very well in advance as to how to answer. So I think the answers that he gave with regards to Putin were pre-planned, actually, and I think that makes things even worse, to be quite honest. I think it shows how dumb, and I don't have a better word, how dumb the Biden White House is and the people around Biden. They have no understanding of foreign policy or diplomacy, because the fact that his statements and his comments were pre-planned, I think is really bad. That's my opinion. But anyway, Stephanopoulos threw his questions out there. Biden had his answers prepared. He called Putin a killer. That is a direct quote. He also said that Putin doesn't have a soul. That is a direct quote. He said that Putin will pay a price for meddling. What meddling Putin has done now, I don't know. But anyway, that's also a direct quote. And this was a diplomatic car crash for the United States. The Kremlin has responded. Putin has responded. And Putin has said, and I quote from RT, the title reads, Putin responds to Biden's insinuation that he's a killer. Says the U.S. president is likely projecting, but I wish him good health.
Putin is, he's an interesting one. Biden is likely projecting when he calls people a killer. Well, yeah, he likely is projecting. Remember, Biden has 40-some years in the government, and I wish him good health. That's something that Alex and Alex here don't ever really mention very in depth, so I'm just going to go ahead and say it here. I think that is a low-key shot at Biden and a kind of a dog whistle, if you will, to people in the know when he wishes Biden good health, because I think Biden is not in good health, and Putin and Biden both know it.
This is exactly what Putin said. Let me get a direct quote here. Putin said that when I was a kid, when we were arguing with each other in the playground, we used to say, whatever you say about others is what you are yourself. That's what Putin also said with regard to Biden's comments. This was talk about owning yourself, talk about an own goal, talk about a complete diplomatic blunder. This was all of those things and much more.
For my non-sports people, an own goal is when you put the ball into your net. So it's like you accidentally score on yourself. So it happens in hockey where you put the puck in your own net sometimes. It also happens in world football or soccer where the ball hits you and then goes in your net. The Biden administration really screwed themselves over on this one.
Worse. I mean, it's comical what happened and what Biden said, because I don't think Biden really understands what's going on at this point in time. But it's also very tragic and very serious, because I don't know how you could walk something like this back. This was a terrible, terrible diplomatic mistake. The entire world, I'm positive, is looking onto this and saying the United States has completely lost their minds. The Biden administration, the Biden White House, has completely degraded and humiliated the office of the presidency. And Peskov actually said that he doesn't believe he's seen anything like this. Peskov being the Kremlin spokesperson, he said that he has not seen anything like this, comments like this, from a United States president ever in the history of relations between the two countries. And that encompasses the times of the USSR, when tensions were very, very high.
So he's saying that he's never heard a president speak this way about a Russian president, even during the Cold War.
You just simply do not call the leader of a country like Russia, or any country for that matter. If you are the United States of America, you simply do not call that leader a killer. I don't care who it is. I don't care what president it is. Obama never even stooped to those levels. They would call Putin a thug. Maybe they would, call him silly names. But to call someone a killer, I think this is a blunder of epic proportions, from bordering on the silly and the dumb, but also on the serious and the tragic and everything in between. The Biden White House and the people around Biden they're showing that they are completely incompetent to engage in foreign relations or diplomacy. Russia's going to disengage. Russia's going to get closer with China. This was a disaster on so many freaking levels. Alexander, I'm stunned by it. I'm stunned at the incompetence.
And you can see on his face, he really is disgusted by this whole situation. So he did a pretty good rundown of what really just went down, right? And this is going to be the prevailing worldview on what Biden's comments were. There will be people in the Democratic Party that will back him fiercely, which is hilarious to me that they've become neoliberal warmongers now. But this will be backed ferociously by some on the left, but honestly, it should be condemned by everyone.
I'm stunned by it. I'm stunned at the incompetence. I'm stunned.
Yeah. I agree with every part of your analysis. First of all, you are absolutely right. This is a car crash. And secondly, it is a car crash that arises from a set of events which were carefully choreographed and planned. Only, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, the person who choreographed and planned this thing is a complete idiot, frankly. I mean, it's completely out of their minds what they were doing. Firstly, we had a publication of an executive summary of a report that dates all the way back to 7th January, when Donald Trump was still president of the United States. This is all a report that was cobbled together by the intelligence community, or at least by a part of the intelligence community, blaming Russia for interfering in the 2020 election and trying to allege that some of the talking points that were floating around at that time, the claims about Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's dealings with Ukraine, for example, and the various claims about the election itself, all arose from Russian disinformation. Well, already we've seen some people having to walk back the Biden-Ukraine aspect of the story. Admit, for example, that the laptop that was found really had nothing to do with Russia. So already that report looks shaky. But the reason this summary of that report, which, as I say, dates back to 7th January 2021, was published, was to provide the setting for this interview between Stephanopoulos and Biden. And you're absolutely right. When you go through it, when you look at the words that Stephanopoulos and Biden use with each other, it's absolutely clear that this is a carefully planned interview. Every word that is used there is carefully prepared in advance, and Stephanopoulos acts throughout the whole interview as Biden's prompter. So he talks to Stephanopoulos says to Biden, will Putin pay a price? Biden says yes. Stephanopoulos says, you said you know that Putin doesn't have a soul. And then, of course, Biden reminisces about this meeting he had with Putin in 2011, where he supposedly told Putin, you don't have a soul. And then, of course, Stephanopoulos comes up to Biden. Remember, Biden is somebody who all reads prompts. And he says, you think he's a killer? And Biden says, oh, yes, I do. And then Stephanopoulos says, so he must pay a price. Well, he's going to pay a price, says Biden. So you can see Stephanopoulos, obviously carefully prepared with his questions, always prompting Biden. Biden is there to basically agree with the talking points that Stephanopoulos is putting to him, and it all derives from this relic of intelligence report dating back to the transition period.
And, you know, I'm not ashamed of this, but my read of the situation is lining up pretty well with what these guys are reading, right? And when we go look at the intelligence community assessment, you're going to see it's even more biased than it sounds as they're describing it now.
Of 2 months ago. Now, calling the leader of another country a killer is absolutely, as you rightly said, unprecedented. The Russians are totally furious about this. We've had Putin's comments, which he says, that Biden is engaging in projection and even wishes Biden good health. Very typical Putin, by the way. Never shows emotion, tries to always put himself in a superior position to his opponents in this kind of thing, and it's fairly easy to do on this occasion. But you get a much better sense of how angry the Russians are from two events. The first is certain comments that were said by Dmitry Peskov, who is the Kremlin spokesman. And I'm going to read the TASS report about them. When asked whether Moscow will take steps in response, the Kremlin spokesman noted that there is nothing to be done. In other words, he's basically saying that this is finished. Responding to the question how such statements could affect bilateral relations, Peskov noted, it is perfectly clear now. He refrained from commenting on the issue in more detail. Biden has shown by his remarks, and this is what Peskov then goes on to say, that he definitely is not planning to improve ties with Russia. In future, cooperation with Washington and Moscow will proceed on that basis. Russia will analyze its approach to cooperation with the US on the issues of interest. And then Peskov went on to say that Biden's interview is a game changer. In other words, that it's completely changed the perspective the Russians have on their relations with the US.
So that about sums that up. Regardless of what you think is or isn't true, this is the feeling that people in the rest of the world have. And there are other countries who did not approve of Biden's comments about Russia. But, the media just won't talk about it. because that's not what they do. So what Alex and Alex from the Duran are trying to say, they're kind of dancing around it, but is this was done, the Russian aspect of this interview was done to make anyone who talks about the Ukraine scandal, the laptop, or any of the stuff, the talking points that came out, a lot of them from Rudy Giuliani and others, anybody who talks about those, you're a Russian troll. You're a Russian disinformation agent. That is the goal. The hardline stance against Russia is to shut people up about Ukraine. The second thing it does is it shifts focus away from China as our number one enemy. When you go back and look at that intelligence community assessment that was just done by like 4 intelligence community and created by the bureaucracy, when you go and you look at it, it's very clear who they want to be the boogeyman and who they say is okay. The intelligence community assessment, in my mind, could have been written by the head of Chinese intelligence. Might as well have been. I'm not saying that Russia doesn't try to influence our elections. They do every year. What I'm saying is when you go look at that intelligence community assessment, you will see that they actively push people away from thinking that China was involved in any kind of influence operations surrounding the election, and they completely will turn your neck sideways and turn your head around to make you look at Russia. It feels like the community assessment that came out, and again, he makes a good point. This came out back in January, and it was just published the day before Biden did the interview. It clearly has biases. So Alexander's making a lot of claims about this intelligence assessment released by the DNI. I feel like it's pertinent for us to at least go through here and verify the things that Alexander from the Duran is saying. First of all, one of his claims was that this was originally from an intelligence assessment that was started while Trump was still in office back in January, which wouldn't surprise me because it was declassified on the 15th of March, and this executive summary for the president was written on 10 March. So far, that's exactly what he said. This document is declassified version of a classified report. The analytic judgments outlined here are identical to those in the classified version, but the declassified document does not include the full supporting information and does not discuss specific intelligence reports, sources, and methods. The intelligence community assessment was prepared by the National Intelligence Council under the auspices of the NIO, the CIA, DHS, FBI, INR, and NSA, coordinated with CIA, DIS, FBI, IRN, Treasury, and the NSA. And then immediately at the first sentence of the background paragraph, we find this document is a declassified version of a classified report that the intelligence community provided to the president, senior executive branch officials, and congressional leadership and intelligence oversight committees on 7 January 2021. So the first claim that he made, that this intelligence report had been out since January and that it was re-released for public consumption just before this interview to further bolster his claims about Russia, is absolutely accurate. Key Judgment 1. We have no indication that any foreign actor attempted to alter any technical aspect of the voting process in the 2020 elections, including voter registration, casting ballots, vote tabulation, or reporting results. We assess that it would be difficult for a foreign actor to manipulate election processes at scale without detection by intelligence collection on the actors themselves through physical and cybersecurity monitoring all around voting systems across the country or in post-election audits. They identified some compromises of state and local government networks prior to Election Day, as well as a higher number of unsuccessful attempts that we assess were not directed at altering election processes. Some foreign actors, such as Iran and Russia, spread false or inflated claims about alleged compromises of voting systems to undermine public confidence in the election processes and results. You can tell in the first key judgment what they want to do. They want to say the assessment of the 2016 election was centered around cyber, right? It was centered around cyber, the release of the WikiLeaks and all of that. They're saying this election cycle, it wasn't. Why are they doing that? Well, what is the main accusation this election cycle? That it was electronically modified. So they have now 360'd, and they don't want to talk about electronic modifying of the votes whatsoever, or the possibility whatsoever. It's just immediately shot down. And then at the last sentence of the paragraph, however, some countries such as Iran and Russia, notice China is left out of that, Iran and Russia, now they are spreading false or inflated claims about alleged compromises of the voting systems to undermine public trust. They're no longer actually doing cyber attacks this time like they were last time, but now they're lying about how severe their cyber attacks are to cause us to think the voting system is not secure. Key judgment 2. We assess that Russian President Putin authorized and a range of Russian government organizations conducted influence operations aimed at denigrating President Biden's candidacy and the Democratic Party, supporting former President Trump, undermining public confidence in the electoral process, and exacerbating socio-political divisions in the U.S. Unlike in 2016, we did not see persistent Russian cyber efforts to gain access to election infrastructure. So there you go. That's exactly what I was just trying to say. Now all the evil companies, right, all the evil actors, right, they weren't trying to do cyber attacks this time. They were putting out false hit pieces to undermine the election process and President Biden. Now, the election process itself doesn't suck, and that's why it's undermined. And President Biden himself didn't have a bunch of baggage and garbage with him. That's not why he was undermined. No, it was a result of Russian interference. And then people like intelligence actors in Russia acting with knowledge, and then little old unsuspecting morons like me who was just too dumb not to realize that the Hunter Biden laptop story was Russian disinformation. I don't know any better. See, it's the two ways people who, on the other side of this see this information, right? They see you as an active agent putting out disinformation, or someone too stupid to see that it's disinformation. And in reality, all we are people who are not willing to accept the intelligence community on its face value. And we need to go look at the information behind the judgments. Why? Oh, I don't know. Let's just go. Do we have to go down the list? The Gulf of Tonkin, September 11, chemical weapons in Iraq. I mean, when is the intelligence community correct? Let's just make a list of the times that the intelligence community was correct. I'm sure that's shorter. Key judgment 3. We assess that Iran carried out a multi-pronged covert influence campaign intended to undercut former President Trump's re-election prospects, though without directly promoting his rivals, undermine public confidence in the electoral process in U.S. institutions, and sow division and exacerbate societal tensions in the U.S. They do quietly admit that the Iranian influence that they are seeing is actually to undermine President Trump's re-election prospects. Why? Well, because they want the U.S. back in the Iran nuke deal, and they know Uncle Biden's going to give them that. And then I think this is hilarious, though without directly promoting his rivals. Okay. Key judgment 4. We assess that China did not deploy interference efforts and considered but did not deploy influence efforts intended to change the outcome of the U.S. president election. Now, anybody who knows anything knows that key judgment 4 here is an out-and-out lie. I saw so much Chinese propaganda flooding the airways during our last presidential election that it was nauseating. Chinese propaganda had made its way onto YouTube. There were active Chinese propaganda Twitter handles that didn't get banned even when I got removed from Twitter. And yet, their key judgment, number 4, is exactly what I said this entire intelligence assessment was meant to do. It was meant to pull people away from looking at China and back to looking at Russia, because it's becoming very obvious that one head of this hydra that we call our federal government wants China to be the new boogeyman, and the other head of this hydra really wants Russia to be the boogeyman, and they all have their own individual reasons for it, but none of them are to benefit us. It's all to benefit them. We have high confidence in this judgment. China sought stability in its relationship with the United States, did not view either election outcome as being advantageous enough for China to risk getting caught meddling, and assessed its traditional influence tools, primarily targeted economic measures and lobbying, would be sufficient to meet its goal of shaping U.S.-China policy regardless of the winner. The NIO for Cyber assesses, however, that China did take some steps to undermine former President Trump's re-election. Ding! So now we have China and Iran. Their influence was to undermine the Trump presidency. This is why you're not hearing about it. This is why Biden is going hard at Putin and Putin only. This is why George Stephanopoulos didn't ask him about the Ayatollah. He didn't ask him about Xi Jinping, because in this interview, he was set up to only talk about the Russian threat by this intelligence community release. That in this release, it mentions that both China and Iran did employ influence tactics, but to undermine President Trump. So at the top of key judgment 4, they say, we assess that China did not deploy interference efforts and considered but did not deploy influence efforts intended to change the outcome of the U.S. presidential election. But then at the last sentence in the paragraph, it says the NIO for Cyber assesses, however, that China did take some steps to try to undermine former President Trump's re-election. How are both of those sentences in the same paragraph? Key judgment 5, we assess that a range of additional foreign actors, including Lebanese Hezbollah, Cuba, and Venezuela, took some steps to attempt to influence the election. Unbelievable. So now we're going to talk about the other category. It's like you have China influencing 60%, you have Russia influencing 30%, you have Iran influencing 9%, and then you have Lebanese, Hezbollah, Cuba, and Venezuela in the other category taking up 1%, and yet they get an entire key judgment. So the bold things here are the things that they really want people to take away from this. And they want people to take away that we have no indications that any foreign actor attempted to interfere in the 2020 U.S. election by altering any technical aspect of the voting process, including voter registration, ballot casting, vote tabulation, or reporting results. So they want that put to bed. That is a non-discussion. We're not talking about this. None of that was altered in any of that way. We're only going to talk about influence campaigns this election. We're not talking about any cyber threats or threats to the actual process. Because why? They're defending it. A key element of Moscow's strategy this election cycle was its use of people linked to Russian intelligence to launder influence narratives, including misleading or unsubstantiated allegations against President Biden through U.S. media organizations, U.S. officials, and prominent U.S. individuals, some of whom were close to former President Trump and his administration. So this was the shot at Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, and all his other group of people that he had trying to help him, and they're saying that these people either wittingly or unwittingly were used as pawns by Russia to put out Russian disinformation about President Biden. This paragraph right here is supposed to strike fear into the heart of any media personality who had the gall to report on these situations, these talking points that came up during the election. The veracity of these accusations is never addressed, but it is not misleading and unsubstantiated whatsoever. And the laptop that was found in Delaware had absolutely nothing to do with a Russian influence campaign. And that's where a lot of this information came out of. So this is a tentative connection at best, and at worst, it's just complete bullcrap in order to really make the people who helped Trump feel like a ghost just walked over their grave when they read that. We assess that President Putin and other senior Russian officials were aware of and probably directed Russia's influence operation against the 2020 U.S. presidential election. So at the beginning, at the very top, in the key points takeaway, they say that Putin definitely directed this. And then now here, the language is different. It says that senior Russian officials were aware of and what? Probably directed Russia's influence operations. Well, we assess that President Putin And the Russian state authorized and conducted influence operations against the 2020 U.S. presidential election aimed at denigrating President Biden and the Democrat Party, supporting former President Trump, undermining public confidence in the electoral process, and exacerbating socio-political divisions in the U.S. Unlike in 2016, we did not see persistent Russian cyber efforts to gain access to election infrastructure. In the election where the election infrastructure is questioned, there are 0 cyber attacks that year. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? They're only going to acknowledge cyber attacks in 2016 when that flub happened and that evil man got elected. We assess that Russia's intelligence services, Ukraine-linked individuals with ties to Russian intelligence and their networks and Russian state media, trolls, and online proxies engaged in activities targeting the 2020 U.S. presidential election. So if the first one was meant to strike fear into all the people that surrounded Trump and helped him, this one is to strike fear on people like me or anyone else who reported on these stories because they found validity in them, because they found truth in them. Now, just like Alex and Alex were saying on the Duran, this is all targeted to make anybody who talks about the talking points that came up during the 2020 election nothing more than, once again, another 4 years of being a Russian troll. Throughout the election cycle, Russia's online influence actors sought to affect U.S. public perceptions of the candidates, as well as advance Moscow's long-standing goals of undermining confidence in U.S. election processes and increasing socio-political divisions among the American people. We assess that Russian leaders viewed President Biden's potential election as disadvantageous to Russian interests and that this drove their efforts to undermine his candidacy. We assess Russian leaders preferred that former President Trump win the election despite perceiving some of his administration's policies as anti-Russian. So even though Trump was vehemently anti-Russian and was put bad sanctions on them and was literally on paper one of the strongest presidents against Russia, they're saying they still wanted Trump to win. Russia still wanted Trump to win. As the election neared, Kremlin officials took some steps to prepare for a Biden administration, probably because they believed former President Trump's prospects for re-election had been diminished. So the Kremlin, supposedly wanting to get Trump into office, at the same time they started their disinformation campaign, they started preparing for Biden to be in the office. Just think about the mental gymnastics you have to do to not think, oh, they started their campaign to influence our elections, and at the same time they've started preparing for a Biden administration, so their campaign to influence our elections would most likely be to lift up who? The person they're preparing to run the country, Biden. But no, the intelligence assessment is doing this big loop-de-loo, and they're saying, even though Russia knew Trump was vehemently anti-Russia on paper and with sanctions and such, they still prepared for Biden to come in as president, but they were working for Trump. Moscow almost certainly views meddling in U.S. elections as an equitable response to perceived actions by Washington and an opportunity to both undermine U.S. global standing and influence U.S. decision-making. So this is basically the basic policy of Russia. It's also the basic policy of the United States to Russia, and it says absolutely nothing. We assess with high confidence that Iran carried out an influence campaign during the 2020 U.S. election season intended to undermine the re-election prospects of former President Trump and to further its long-standing objectives of exacerbating divisions in the U.S., creating confusion, and undermining legitimacy of the U.S. elections and institutions. We did not identify Iran engaging in any election interference activities as defined in this assessment. And then here they're assessing that Iran increased its volume of and aggressiveness of cyber-enabled influence efforts. So it's cyber, but it's only to influence. Right next to it, you see, we assess Iranian actors did not attempt to manipulate or attack any election infrastructure. We assess that Iran primarily relied on cyber tools and methods to conduct its covert operations because they are low cost, deniable, scalable, and do not depend on physical access to the United States. So do you understand how insane this is? So they're saying they didn't conduct any cyber espionage against us because they didn't technically attack infrastructure. All their influence peddling they did was only through cyber tools, but we're not going to call those cyber intrusions. We assess that China did not deploy interference efforts and consider considered but did not deploy efforts intended to change the outcome of the U.S. presidential election. We did not identify China attempting to interfere with election infrastructure or provide funding to any candidates or parties. Beijing probably judged risk of interference was not worth reward. We assess that Beijing's risk calculus against influencing the elections was informed by China's preference for stability in the bilateral relationship, their probable judgment that attempting to influence the election could do lasting damage to U.S.-China ties, and belief that the election of either candidate would present opportunities and challenges for China. This is absolutely insane. Trump is the clear antithesis to China. He is the clear enemy of China, and Biden is the clear friend. And for the intelligence community to be putting out an assessment like this, just denying reality, shows that, like I said earlier in this before we started going over it, it's just like a Chinese intelligence operative wrote this assessment report. We assess that Beijing also believes there is a bipartisan consensus against China in the United States that leaves no prospect for a pro-China administration regardless of the election outcome. Thanks to President Trump. Before Trump, there was not a consensus against China. Before Trump, all of the NWO leaders in our government, the neoliberals and the neocons, they all saw China as the manufacturing hub of the world, right? That was the cog in the globalist system that it fit into. And they were just fine offshoring everything they needed to in order to make that happen. That's why we will ship the chickens over there so that they can get processed into chicken breasts, and then we'll ship them all the way back to the United States. That's globalism for you. Meanwhile, people buying the chicken off the shelves are doing it with money from unemployment because they don't have a job that they could have had at that chicken plant that was off-shipped to China. And then here they have to actually put a minority view in this report. See, when they did the quote, 17 intelligence agencies have all agreed on the assessment of Russian interference in 2016, they tried to make it seem like all of the agencies were on the exact same page when Admiral Mike Rogers had specifically stepped outside of those intelligence community and said that he did not have a high level of certainty that certain things had happened that the rest of the intelligence communities spoke about. They made a mistake in not addressing that, and so people in my community and people in the press were able to make our own conclusions about what that meant, and Mike Rogers was able to get that question asked and answered. So this time, in order to prevent that, we have this little box right here called the minority view, as in somebody in this intelligence group did not think the way that we thought. And how did they think about China? The National Intelligence Officer for Cyber assesses that China took at least some steps to undermine former President Trump's re-election chances, primarily through social media and official public statements and media. The NIO agrees with the IC's views that Beijing was primarily focused on countering anti-China policies, but assesses that some of Beijing's influence efforts were intended to at least indirectly affect U.S. candidates, political processes, and voter preferences, meeting the definition for election interference used in this report. The NIO agrees that we have no information suggesting tried to interfere with the election processes. The NIO has moderate confidence in these judgments. This view differs from the IC assessment because it gives more weight to indications that Beijing preferred former President Trump's defeat and the election of a more predictable member of the establishment instead, and that Beijing implemented. So at the beginning of this, I read to you that Iran was targeting Trump. I read to you that Russia was targeting Trump. And they were very careful to say China isn't targeting anybody. But here you can see that there are disagreements in the intelligence community, and what's the one disagreement that you would think somebody would have? Ding! Somebody would have to come out and say the obvious thing, that yeah, China is no friend to President Trump, and obviously they were pushing to not have a President Trump election. All of the influence peddling that was done against Biden was not done by Chinese media. It was done by Hong Kong media. People are so confused that the stuff that was anti-Biden was coming from Hong Kong and lewd media. These are Chinese dissidents. They're people working against China. Those are the people who were releasing the Hunter Biden laptop stuff and all of that information. It was not the Russians, because I was watching it come in. I had to learn how to speak Mandarin, not how to speak Russian, to listen to their newscasts. This entire intelligence assessment is complete nonsense. it is highly disturbing that they would put something like this out. And it is clear that the only reason they're putting this out is to substantiate narratives that they want to put out into the country. And the reason why it's pretty scary is because they just came out with an assessment on DVEs, or domestic violent extremists. And that report is also very much lacking in proof and incidents, and overwhelmingly a bunch of narration and a bunch of mainstream news articles. If there's one thing that I really got disturbed about as I was digging through the Russia collusion nonsense and the FISA, stuff and the about queries and all of that, the thing that disturbed me the most about it was that the intelligence community was getting and creating their assessments based off of mainstream media articles. And then the mainstream media articles would cite anonymous intelligence officials in their articles. It's a giant circular thing that provides no information to the American people. So that's it, guys, on this one. I don't want to go through it anymore. I'll put a link so that you can go read the full thing underneath the pinned comment below. But let's get back into the Biden interview, and we'll close this up.
President Trump reached a deal with the Taliban to have all American troops leave by May 1st. Are they going to leave?
I'm in the process of making that decision now as to when they'll leave. The fact is that that was not a very solidly negotiated deal that the former president, worked out. And so we're in consultation with our allies.
Come on, man. Even people who hate Trump are not going to swallow that. It was a bad deal. Trump renegotiated every deal out there. Come on. Let me ask you a question. What possible excuse would you accept for him extending the time that our soldiers are in Afghanistan while we are going through an unprecedented opioid crisis, and the number one source of opium in the world is being protected by the United States government? How many excuses do you want to hear about why he's extending out the time period before we withdraw? It's time for that war to be over.
As well as the government, and that decision's going to be, it's in process now.
Likely to take longer?
I don't think a lot longer.
But May 1st is tough.
Could happen, but it is tough because, look, one of the drawbacks, George, and this is going to be like Sanskrit to people listening here, but
making the assertion that people aren't going to understand it. It's just a bunch of gobbledygook to people because they can't wrap their little minds around your politics. He's about to talk about the transition, and because the Trump administration wasn't forthcoming with the Biden administration, that's why he's not going to be able to do the troop withdrawal. Are you serious?
It is the failure to have an orderly transition from...
You see that smile? Anytime a politician gives you that smile, they're lying. Let me give it back to you. There you go. See that? See that? See, that's the old grifter smile. I'm lying to you. This is my duper's delight. I can't help it. I love lying to you about this.
From the Trump presidency to my presidency, which usually takes place from election day to the time you're sworn in, has cost me time and consequences. For example, we didn't realize how bad things were in terms of lack of vaccines. We were not able to get access to this information. That's one of the issues we're talking about now in terms of Afghanistan.
Let me ask you about Governor Cuomo of New York. I know you said you want the investigation to continue. If the investigation confirms the claims of the women, should he resign?
We've gone through all these topics. We've talked about everything from the jab's not happening because of patriots, so we might not be able to open. We talked about we're not going to be able to do the troop withdrawal. We talked about the country's new hostile stance toward Russia. And now, according to the Biden administration, one of the most important topics, one of the top 5 topics that they could be talking about right now that they need to address with the American public is Governor Cuomo. Okay. So obviously they're going to be talking about the nursing home scandal and how he should be charged and impeached for that order he gave, right?
Yes, I think he probably ended up being prosecuted too.
But you,
all right.
How about right now? You've said you want the investigation to continue. You saw Chuck Schumer, Senator Gillibrand, majority of the congressional delegation don't think he can be an effective governor right now. Can he serve effectively?
That's a judgment for them to make about their state, whether they can be effective. Here's my position. It's been my position since I wrote the Violence Against Women Act.
I don't think it's going to be possible for him to be considered an effective governor after doing that order, moving those people into those nursing homes, right?
A woman should be presumed to telling the truth and should not be scapegoated.
We're not talking about the thousands of elderly that were murdered. We're talking about the sex scandal. Oh, I was confused.
And become victimized by her coming forward, number one. But there should be an investigation to determine whether what she says is true. That's what's going on now.
And you've been very clear. If the investigation confirms the claims, he's gone.
That's what I think happens. And by the way, it may very well be there could be a criminal prosecution that is attached to it. I just don't know. But let the investigation. And I don't know what it is. But I started with the presumption. It takes a lot of courage for a woman to come forward. So the presumption is it should be taken seriously. And it should be investigated. And that's what's underway now.
I am no fan of Governor Nipple Rings. But the audacity for Biden, the hair sniffer, for Joe the hair sniffer Biden, to say these things and chuck Cuomo under the bus. Unbelievable. I don't even have anything to say about that. Just going to let that dog lie. So there you go, guys. That was Biden's all-important interview with George Stephanopoulos, at least the first half of it. The second half of it I couldn't find anywhere on the internet, so we're just going to go off of this, which this is the cut that has the majority of the news-making questions in them, which makes me really want to get a hold of that second half of the interview, because in there is probably all the dirt, but this is enough for one day. We have got to realize that this interview was choreographed. The questions and answers were prepared. And so when we analyze this interview, which I'll be doing for weeks and weeks to come, you have to understand that this wasn't just Biden was not saying anything off the cuff. This was all planned. And so when you look at what he said through that lens, it all becomes a lot more significant. But anyways, guys, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. I got more content coming. Love you guys. Peace.